Hi, everybody. Welcome. I'm happy to have you this evening. I'm going to give a couple tips on how to use Zoom this evening. You have probably noticed that you've been muted when you've entered the meeting. Please remain muted during the presentation. If you'd like to speak, please use the raise hand function. This meeting is being recorded, and the recording will be available for anybody to view shortly after the event. And the meeting is being transcribed. If you'd like to view the live subtitles, you can click the CC Live Transcript button on the bottom of your Zoom screen, and then click View Subtitles. And if you'd like to view the full transcript, you can click View Full Transcript. So if you have, if you've just joined us, I'm just giving a few tips for our Zoom setup this evening. My name is Mary Velez. I'm a landscape architect with Star White House, and we're excited to have you this evening with us. This information is also located in the chat, but I will just repeat it once more if anybody would like to hear it again. So you've been muted when you entered the meeting. Please remain muted during the presentation. And if you'd like to speak, please use the raise hand function. The meeting is being recorded, and you can view the recording shortly after the event. We're also offering subtitles this evening, and if you'd like to view them, you can click the CC Live Transcript button at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and then click View Subtitles. And if you'd like to view the full live transcript, you can click View Full Transcript. So with sort of the Zoom setup explained, I'm going to now hand it off to George Gorman, who is going to welcome us this evening. Go ahead, George.
Thank you. And as already said, welcome. And thank you all for attending and being part of tonight's community input meeting. I've said this before. We need you. We need the public. We need the park visitors. We need the community. We need everyone to provide us with their thoughts, their suggestions, their input on developing this master plan. Without you and without your input, this will not be successful. So thank you very, very much for being on this call. We started about a year ago. State Parks put together a team from State Parks and hired the consulting firm of the people that have been interacting, Star White House, and they've done a phenomenal job. They're sub-consultants in a lot of background work, a lot of history, a lot of analysis of the property, and that has been a great foundation. And they built upon that. We've had stakeholder meetings, both virtual and in person. Recently, a couple of weeks ago, we had an in-person meeting where about 126 people came by and looked at the presentation, look at everything that had been developed to this point. And this is a continuation of that, so that people have the opportunity to look at what's being discussed, make comments, and improve it, make it better, and let us know where we're screwing up. So we thank you for being here today, and for everyone that was involved in the past meetings. Leading State Parks, we have Diana Carter from our Albany office, Beth Cummings from Historic Preservation, so planning and historic preservation locally, Monica Martinez, Nicole Garofalo, Victoria Federico, Sean Cruikshank, Bill Pirtle, and others. So thank you all very, very much. Star White House has been the lead on it, as I mentioned. But I also wanted to discuss or let you know that we are also moving forward with the plans for the marina. We hired a consultant that has been working with New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. We have spoken to slip holders and some other community members what would be an acceptable layout for the marina, what would be the best operation and location. We've had to make some changes due to environmental concerns. But we're hopeful that we'll be reaching out to the slip holders and the public early next year, so that you can see where we are, what the plans are, make sure that you are happy with them, and then implementing and moving forward. As everyone knows, we we opened with the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, the Marine Resources Building, which is a phenomenal addition to the park. Everybody, they had a good turnout to do the walkthrough and enjoy it and to see what that facility building was about. So we're kind of on a roll. Now, Commissioner spoke at the opening and mentioned that we had the Reichert Foundation provide funding for the rehab of the administration building that we reopened. So that is all so positive and going so well. And without you guys, without your input, we wouldn't be here where we are. We wouldn't be looking at the master plan and trying to finalize it within the next few months. So again, thank you for being on, and don't hesitate. Give us all your input. We have a lot of input already, but the more suggestions, the better the plan will be. So again, thank you all for taking the time to be on this call. We appreciate it. And now I'll turn it back to Star Whitehouse.
Thank you very much, George. I'm Gail Whitwer-Laird, a landscape architect with Star Whitehouse, and we're really excited to be here tonight and to be working on this really fascinating project. For some of you, you may have not come to the first meeting, so we'll share where you can get some of the earlier presentations, and some of you we may be seeing for the second or third time, which is great. So the format of today's presentation will be, we're going to give you an overview of where we are and some early concepts for the master plan. Then we're going to break down into smaller groups. Each of us will be facilitating what we call breakout rooms, and our Zoom coordinator will help put you in those breakout rooms so we can listen to you and talk to you as if we were at a public meeting, only doing it virtually. And we will have boards of the early concepts in those rooms. So if you weren't able to come to the in-person meeting, we're doing this the same style as we would if we were in the same room. So we want it to be a conversation. And as George said, your input is critical to the success of the project. With no further ado, I'll get started. As George mentioned, we have what we call a core team here of representatives from Albany, as well from Parks, as well as the State Historic Preservation Office. We are leading the master plan, but we have a very highly specialized group of sub-consultants that help with building conservation associates, helping with historic preservation. Cashin is our local civil engineer, and Bay Environmental is our ecologist. We also had an archaeologist do a phase 1A report on the project. So here today from BCA, we have Michelle Boyd and Nate Schlent. Wave your hands. They're our historic preservation experts and have done fantastic research on the project. We have Nancy Lentz from Cashin Associates. Their office is just down the road, so they've been a great resource for us. And Andrew Thyberg from Bay Environmental, who is our ecologist and has probably walked every inch of the site, looking at it from a very unique ecological perspective. So that's our team. And just so you know where we are in the schedule. So as George said, a year ago, we started just trying to understand what's there. We looked at the existing ecology. We did a study of the circulation, which you'll see some of it today. BCA did a buildings inventory, and we had a series of public information meetings. And from those meetings, we've now come up with some early concepts, which we're going to share today. And then after that, we will develop those concepts further into a more refined plans. As part of this process, State Parks also will prepare an environmental impact statement. That's what an EIS stands for. And we will come back to you again in the spring to get comments on those further refined plans, take your feedback again, and then develop the final master plan and the final EIS simultaneously. If for some reason you weren't able to come to some of the earlier meetings and want to know more about this master plan process, you can go to the State Parks website, parks.ny.gov, inside our agency /master plans. And you scroll down to Nissequogue River State Park and you can find all of the previous presentations on this project. So today we're going to focus on early concepts. So just so you understand where we are in this larger process. we wanted to start a little more philosophically before we get into the details, but what's really fascinating and unique about Nissequogue River State Park is its history as a mental institution. And the choice of the location of the mental institution and the creation of the hospital here was rooted in a philosophy of healing by being in nature and being surrounded by a community of people. So it's pretty special to have that history as part of the park. And so what we'd like to do is really honor that history going forward in the reimagining of this former hospital campus as a park, but still thinking of it as a place of respite and healing and a place to immerse yourself in nature, especially now when we all need to find an escape from the reality that surrounds us. So we're very inspired by the site's history, but we are also here to convert it from a hospital campus into a park, which is a very different set of criteria. So in the phase 1, we did what's called a recreational needs assessment, and we did an online survey that many of you and your community responded to. I think we had over 1,600 respondents asking about what you'd like to see in the park. In terms of amenities, the pedestrian trail system, bike system, and multi-use trail system were at the top of everyone's list. Everyone wants a place to jog, bike, hike. So that was clearly expressed in the results here. Secondary items were restoring natural habitat. This is an extremely important place on the mouth of the river, where the mouth of the river meets the sound, as well as botanical gardens and community gardens. There was a big interest in gardens. And then basic amenities that every park should have: playgrounds, dog parks, as well as wayfinding. So those are the top 10 amenities from the early survey. In terms of facilities, people overwhelmingly want bathrooms, restrooms, comfort stations, outdoor venues, perhaps a place for a market, and also a very big desire for cafes. And 37% of 1,600 people want a brewery. I don't know how you feel about that, George, but there's a large population that would like to see a brewery in the park. So here we are. So here's just some inspirational images about kind of the character of the park that we'd like to create. Something that's, open, flexible. You can have a concert one day and just a beautiful open lawn the next. So in looking at the feedback that we got and the research, we started to coalesce that research into these 3 themes that are guiding the concept plan, that have to do with history, habitat, and health, and how they all come together in this park. We'd like to work with the community and the Long Island region on the preservation aspect of the project, weave that preservation narrative into the programming and interpretation. Habitat's very important. The park has a large birds conservation area and some protected wetlands along the northern shore. And health, we want this to be a place where people can go to exercise, to bring their children, to have a picnic. This should be a place where you find yourself and your community. Some of the early analysis we did with Bay Environmental, we mapped the different types of forest, where there were either older forests or new forests coming up where it was cleared. What's interesting is that you can see the perimeter of the park really has this nice forested edge, and that kind of protects the park and also protects the community from having the active areas right up next to it. So one of the early concepts is, how can we reconnect some of these missing pieces of that edge? So the next thing that we did is we also just looked at what are the main assets here, and what are some of the constraints that we need to deal with in the master plan. The park has beautiful views. We want to preserve those views from the northern edge of the park, and there's also some interesting views from the opposite end of the park from what was a former coal ash pile. So where are these kind of special moments in the park and how can we preserve those? There's amazing waterfront access for kayaks and the marina that George mentioned. So you have waterfront access and you also have a large amount of open areas, many of which are in some of the former building locations that are open to be programmed, whether it's active recreation or passive recreation. You have 520 acres. That's a lot of parkland to play with. And so it's really exciting to give this place the framework that it needs for a park. One of the things that struck us the most, which is in contrast to what we saw in the surveys, people really want a path network. And in what you have now, it lacks a cohesive path network. There are paths into the park that dead end or, hike and bike trails that don't make a loop. So one of the things we want to look at is how we can create a cohesive circulation network for the park. The other thing is looking at where people cross roads to go from one side of the park to the other, and how can we make that safer? We want the recreational facilities to be for all ages and all abilities. A successful park is for everyone, and that's very important to our design philosophy as we go into this. And lastly, the former hospital buildings are being inventoried and analyzed for their condition, their health, if you will, and what makes sense to keep that can support park programming and what doesn't make sense to keep. So that's kind of the philosophical framework that we have here. So I'd like to turn the presentation over briefly to Nancy Lentz from Cashin, who did a very thorough inventory of the circulation system as it exists. And then after that, we'll go to Nate from Building Conservation Associates, share with you the early concepts, and then go into our breakout rooms. So Nancy, are you here?
Nancy may still be having some IT issues.
Okay.
We may need to have you present in her stead.
Okay, that's fine. So we looked at the circulation system in layers. And as you know, it was a former hospital campus. So it was designed for cars to enter in and park and access these different buildings. Many of the buildings are no longer there. And the purpose of the landscape now is to be pedestrian focused and people focused. So we looked at the existing trail system. It's a part of the Long Island Greenbelt Trail. That's this green line here. And there's also the existing hike and bike trail that goes from 25A to Tiffany Field. So you have two important hike and bike and pedestrian trails already that we'd like to tap into and further connect in the park plan. There are a number of sidewalks that were from the former campus, but many of them, are sidewalks to nowhere. So, those are things that we want to remove and replace with a park path network rather than sidewalks and streets. So there's a different way of looking at the landscape here. And then lastly, the vehicular traffic, the roads that go along Old Dock Road and St. Johnland, and how that affects the park experience. So another thing that Cashin did is they mapped the inactive parking lots and closed roads. You can see in yellow, these are all paved and underutilized areas. So if you think about the amount of area here and its potential for parkland, you have a lot more space than you see when you're out there today. And how can we use those open areas better for park purposes? So this is kind of a compilation of that circulation study. Again, you see here, kind of paths that go in the woods but don't quite connect. A path up the hill and a path down the hill. And then I know when we were there as a group, hiking to what we call the North Woods part of the park, you have to kind of look both ways and run to cross the road. So what can we do in terms of traffic calming and other things to make it easier to access all areas of the park? So there's no cohesive circulation network. The park is fragmented by the roads. And it's also unclear where to park if you are driving to the park in relation to what park activities there are. So that's something that we want to make sure and understand. Some people will come to the park by car, and where do you go to access different activities in the park? And accessibility is also another thing that we want to look at, making sure that a good portion of the park is accessible. This is a diagram just showing you, even though you have this 520 acres, it's divided into 4 pieces because of its fragmentation by the road. So one of the early circulation concepts, and we'll have the same maps in the breakout rooms, so you can dive into it in more detail. But so one of the early concepts is to actually build upon this existing hike and bike trail that stops here and create a loop that goes around the entire park. So this would be a paved loop, and something that you could do with a stroller or a bicycle or however means you'd like. And at the same time, we'd like to keep the soft loop that you have in the Long Island Greenbelt Trail and continue that loop around the park. At some points, it would intersect the upper loop, and in other areas, it would be more of a nature trail. So you would have a parallel circulation network of a paved loop and a soft loop. So that's one of the early concepts we have for that. Additionally, acknowledging that some people are coming by car. If there's active recreation and you have a sports team in the car, we would have a series of trailheads, if you will. It's a very typical thing for a park of this size, so that you would come into the park and go to a trailhead parking area, depending on which portion of the park you're going to. So the marina also has a new parking area as part of its design. So we're acknowledging the new parking area for the marina, as well as other areas of the park. So even though you wouldn't be able to drive through the park anymore, you can still come to the edges and find a trailhead to get to the rest of the park. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Nate, who's going to refresh your memory on the history, the very fascinating history of this park, as well as some early findings and early thoughts on how to adapt this inventory of buildings for the park.
Thank you, Gail. So prior to outlining our analysis of the former hospital buildings, I wanted to provide some historic context and shed some light on the development periods of the site. Prior to Smithtown's establishment in 1665, the site was inhabited by the native Nissequogue tribe, after which the park is named. In 1884, Kings County established the Kings County Farm and Asylum, what would eventually become the Kings Park Psychiatric Center. BCA identified 4 major periods of development of the hospital site. The first was from 1884 to 1895, when Kings County operated the asylum as a self-sufficient farming community. You can see some pictures at the top and bottom of that. The second from 1900 to 1919, which was the state hospital's first major period of expansion, where a lot of the early ward buildings were constructed. Then from 1919 to 1945, or the interwar period, which was defined by the decline of the hospital's population and the demolition of many of its earliest buildings. The last period we identified was from 1946. And then the hospital ultimately closed in 1996, which was later converted into the Nissequogue River State Park in 2000. Next slide. So the farm asylum was a self-sufficient community where patients and medical staff cohabitated with the belief that working the land and being in nature was supposed to be healing and reparative. The structures built by the asylum, which are shown in yellow in the map to the left, were simple wood structures used to house patients and staff and support agricultural activities. The first 2 pictures on the right show what that might have been like. The state began to rapidly expand after the acquisition in 1895, when they constructed many of the larger infrastructural and ward buildings, including Kings Park Boulevard, which you can see at the bottom, to support the growing patient and employee population. Next slide. The interwar period was the single largest period of expansion in the hospital's history. Following World War I, the hospital constructed 21 buildings known as the Veterans Memorial Hospital Unit. Those are the buildings shown in yellow on the north end of the campus, which was New York's primary psychiatric center for the treatment of war veterans. The hospital continued to expand between World War I and World War II, constructing some of the largest ward buildings, which are shown in green on the map. To accommodate these new structures, many of the early farm asylum buildings were demolished. Those are the small buildings that were shown in the previous, but are now shown in red. So this idea of reinvention of the site through the demolition of older buildings and the construction of newer, larger buildings became a common theme throughout the history of the hospital. The hospital continued to grow and reached a peak population of over 10,000 employees and patients by 1954. After the introduction of new medications that allowed doctors to treat patients outside of an institutional setting, the population in state hospitals across the country began to decline. As the population fell, many of the oldest buildings at the Kings Park Psychiatric Center were not needed and fell into disrepair. You can see that two pictures at the bottom of Group 1 when it burnt down and ultimately was abandoned. To consolidate its operations, the state built a large complex of wards on the south end of the campus, those are shown in green, and demolished over 30 buildings along Kings Park Boulevard, many of those buildings dating from the earliest period of the hospital's history in the late 19th century. Those are the ones shown in red. The loss of these early ward buildings had a profound impact on the history and integrity of the site. Next slide. So these aerials, the one on the left is from 1947 and the one on the right is from 2020, help to illustrate the scale of demolitions and their effect on the integrity and the density of buildings on the site. And in addition to the buildings that were demolished, many of the landscape features were altered or removed, including an orchard that once ran along Orchard Road, ornamental trees that once lined Kings Park Boulevard, and many recreational fields that dotted the campus. The following two slides include a selection of photographs that illustrate the impact of these changes and their effect on the site's historic integrity and the perception on the ground. The images at the top, provided by the Kings Park Heritage Museum, are archival photographs of the site in the early 20th century. The images at the bottom, taken by BCA, taken by me, show the same vantage points in 2020. So you can really get a sense of how the landscape changed over those 100 years. While the demolitions greatly affected the integrity and perception of the site, there are some individual buildings that remain relatively unaltered and could potentially be adaptively reused in the next phase of development for the site, which is as the state park. As previously mentioned, the public, through various focus groups and public surveys, identified a number of facilities they would like to see added to the park. I think Gail mentioned a farmer's market, a brewery, and restrooms. So BCA performed an inventory of the existing buildings to identify which ones were most compatible with those desired programming based on their condition, their size, and their location within the park. The most compatible buildings, which are those shown in yellow, tended to be smaller and located along active vehicular and pedestrian thoroughfares. These buildings are typically in better condition than the larger ward buildings at the park's periphery. Buildings that did not meet those metrics may be retained for future use. Those that we think have the most potential to be reused at a later date are shown in orange, or prioritized for future removal, which are those shown in red. The buildings not under consideration for reuse typically were either too large to support the public's preferred facilities, are in the worst condition as compared to those smaller structures, which are those in yellow or the ones in orange.
Great. Thank you very much, Nate. And when we do go into the breakout rooms, we are going to have one room that is just about buildings, and Nate and Michelle from BCA, as well as Bill from State Park or from State Historic Preservation Office will be there. So if you want to talk buildings, you can go into the the special buildings breakout room. So now I'm just going to share very quickly some of the early overall concepts for the park. And we want to then go into our breakout rooms and have as much time as possible with you to get feedback on these early concepts. So let me go through them fairly quickly, and then we'll regroup at the end after we go into our breakout room. So in addition to creating a new circulation network and finding some of the smaller structures that we can repurpose to serve park functions, we've created a framework of what we're calling park districts that tap into what's unique about the different areas of the park. On the north, we have what we're calling the waterfront district, which has the hike and bike trail, access to the waterfront, and some of the nicest views of the park. Below that, we have what we're calling the botanical district, which still has an active greenhouse and was the site of former farming activities and gardening on the site. So in this area, and we did a walking tour of this area when we were on site on Saturday. So that would be kind of the garden within the park, if you will. The center of the park, we're calling the Pastoral Corps, which would be a large, open, flexible area of the park, flanked by some possibly markets or other things in buildings that Nate had flagged. And then finally, the two southern ends of the park, one would be dedicated to active recreation and one to wooded paths and possibly an equestrian center. There was a request for an equestrian uses at the park as well. So that's the overall conceptual framework. So we have the Waterside District seen here. Here's the newly renovated administration building headquarters for the park, as well as the kind of open lawn area that has been improved since the park, since it became a park in 1996. One of the key ideas to this area is also opening up the reservoir. Right now, it's a beautiful water feature, but it's hidden behind fences and dense overgrowth. And one of the early concepts is softening the edge so it's not so steep and it's safe to be along it, and creating an accessible path around that reservoir. So that's one key feature of a change to that area of the park. As well, in this area, one of the buildings might become a museum. That was something that people also had a very strong interest in. So this would be the cultural district of the park, if you will. And here are some images in support of those types of activities that could happen in that area of the park. So a softened edge along the reservoir, access to the waterfront, possibly event venues in some of the older buildings, or outdoor art installations. And then another key feature is a grade separated crossing to connect you from the Waterside District to the southern end of the park, so you don't have to cross St. John Lynn. The next area of the park we're calling the Botanical District. Here you can see an image of the greenhouse, still very much in use, and some outdoor flower gardens that could be expanded as an area for community gardens, or even an area just to do more intensely planted things or more unique flora. There's already lots of specimen trees in the landscape and quite a few in this area. The former director's house was here in this lower corner of the park, and around that house there are a number of interesting trees and landscape features that could be repurposed as a botanic garden within the park. It's also in close proximity to the marina, which we think is a really nice feature. So as the marina is redeveloped, you have a destination right next to it within the park. There's some images of that. I don't know how many of you know the Bayard Cutting Arboretum, but that's a nice precedent to look at. There's a small cafe and beautiful gardens. So the gardens are the first thing, but there are some small park amenities to support what happens in the garden. As well as community gardens. I think we'd like to hear how much interest there is in those types of things, as well as making sure that these garden areas are accessible. The next is the Pastoral Corps. So you can see here, there's a significant amount of open space here, but again, disconnected by the road and lacking in kind of basic park amenities like benches and perhaps additional shade trees and things, something to make it more of a park scale rather than the institutional scale. I think that's key everywhere. So here's some early ideas for that, creating an open, flexible lawn and defining smaller spaces within that lawn. We know there's also an active model airplane contingent. We definitely keep space for that activity to keep happening. But there's also a lot of additional space that can be programmed in that area. And it's high, it's flat, and has a lot of potential. We also, in that same area, you can see here, actually there's a slope. At the bottom of the slope, there's an area that could be programmed with some additional active recreation, whether it's specialized bike trails or markets. What we call the North Woods is this section of the park over here, which really doesn't, is kind of second growth forest. Andrew is going to join us in one of the breakout rooms, and he can talk a little bit more in detail about the forest ecology if you're interested in that. And is one of the places that has some magnificent views at the top here. There's also a cemetery there will be protected and remains in the park. And I think early on, we've also talked about having some interpretive signage or things to tell people about what's in these different areas. And here at the northern corner of the North Woods is a potential location for an equestrian center and would be strategically located also to access Sunken Meadow State Park, which also has a lot of equestrian trails. So this seems like a prime place to have any kind of equestrian facility. And again, as I mentioned, we would have trailheads, parking areas to these different facilities, acknowledging that it is a big park and not everyone can walk the full length of the park to get where they need to get. So here's some images of what that area could support. And finally, what we call the Southgate Recreation area. So the southern end of the park is closest to the schools in the neighborhood. It also has some good open flat areas. We want to minimize any disturbance to forested areas for open fields. And we want to make sure that they're close and accessible to schools and community that it's most interested in active recreation. So we've consolidated that type of use in this area. There is also Tiffany Fields to the north, but this would be in complement to that. And we have a special breakout room for this. We'd like to know what is the proportion of active recreation you are interested in, what types of active recreation you're interested in. Active recreation doesn't have to be just fields. There's a big movement now to do outdoor fitness. I'm sure some of you have seen that, and that could be something that we could incorporate in this area or other areas of the park if people are interested in. But it's nice to have, a chin-up bar or two along the way to support just the hiking and jogging. So that's something we'd like to consider in this area, as well as possibly a splash park, maybe bike rentals if there's a desire for that, as well as regular open fields. So this is kind of the character of that end of the park. So with that, I would like to encourage people to choose a breakout room, and Annabelle will help facilitate if you don't know how to get into a breakout room. But at the bottom of the screen, there's a small bar and it says breakout rooms, and it will pop up and you can select which breakout room you'd like to go into. If you need help getting into a breakout room, Annabelle can help you into a room.
If you advance the slide one more, we can also tell folks where the best breakout room for their interests might be.
Yeah. So there'll be 5 rooms. The Waterside District, Northwoods and Botanical District are combined. The Pastoral Corps, the Southgate Recreation area, and the buildings. because you choose one of these topics, it doesn't mean you can't talk about the whole park. I want to make that very clear. We will also have in the boards plans of the whole park. So you can, it was just a way of getting all the gardeners in one room and active sports people in another, so we can have a more meaningful, more focused conversation. But that doesn't mean you can't talk about anything. So it's just a way of kind of getting people of common interest together.
And you can switch rooms, right, Gail?
Yes, and you can switch rooms.
Okay.
We had one, Mary May was in the middle of sentence. We might want to allow.
This is Gary May.
Yes.
Under Mary's husband. I was wondering if there's anything with the buildings. I was on the different group, and I was wondering if there are any plans to have like a nature center, like in Tapapusha and Seaford. They have a building there with audio visual experiences and anything to commemorate the previous use of the park as a hospital.
Now, those are both ideas that actually came up early on as well. So Nature Center and museum are both on people's top lists. So I think, are we all back from our breakout rooms?
Yeah.
I don't think we had a choice.
Yeah, so we're back. So what I'd like to do now is have someone from each room, someone from Star White House or BCA from each room, just give us the highlights of your discussion. So everyone who's at the meeting today can hear what other people shared in their breakout rooms. So who wants to start? I will designate. Why don't we start at the north end of the park? How about the Waterfront Cultural District?
Yeah,
Elizabeth.
I can start. So we had a great discussion. Both Keith and Paul already used the park for boating. And Paul talked a lot about going kayaking with kids and how there could be ways to make kayaking safer. And exploring different options of how you can actually get into the water. And Chris had a really great suggestion talking about the museum and kind of like educational opportunities and how we should celebrate the landscape and the connection to the water, and how the museum doesn't just need to be this like physical building, but could also be throughout the park with signage and explain different things that are happening in the water or different plants that are there. So we had a really great discussion. So thank you guys for contributing.
Wow, that is really great. I love the idea of the museum isn't just a thing, but it's an experience throughout the park. That's a really nice idea. Next, how about the Pastoral Corps?
Oh, okay. So we had two really fabulous participants. Matthew, who is an airplane flyer and was detailing for us how to make the park more accommodating for the flyers group of people, with having a distinct place to enter the park with the planes, and then a short runway, and then like the size of a couple of football field area for flying them, and some kind of a shelter so people have shade and places to sit and all of that. And then there seems to be a huge airplane flying community on Long Island that we could really tap into. And I know on the 16th when we were in the park, there were a lot of airplane people. It's great for senior citizens, and it's also, we talked about trying to get more youth involved because of the kind of science and engineering and aviation community on Long Island, and really capturing that younger audience as a way of supporting STEM programs and things like that. And then Mike Risotto was also joined our group and was very complimentary about the pastoral ideas we had, including removing the boulevard. And then we talked about the site where the sewage treatment plant may go, and some ideas about how to create a win-win-win situation there to, maybe try to bury the sewage treatment plant in the landscape and then have the park pastoral continuity there. Eddie Joe, did I leave anything out? Anybody?
I think that was a good summary.
Okay, thank you.
Great, thank you, Laura. I'll do the summary, unless, Wong, would you like to do the summary for the Pastoral Corps?
I mean, I'm good with either way. I can
Yeah.
do it. Okay. So I think for us, we have a lot of ideas covering actually like all different parts of the park. So first of all, Linda and I think Mary May were talking about more active recreation with a slide riding hill or miniature golf, which can be more like in the Southgate Recreation area. And Linda was voicing a lot of concern regarding how the current slide riding activity is happening so close to the road. And then we have opinions or ideas from Dorothy regarding entry points from surrounding neighborhoods on the southeastern side of the park, where she can like actually ride her bike to enter the park and enter some of the bike trails. And then Pat had an idea of both Pat and Leon had ideas about restore or holding concerts in the restored York Hall. And did I miss anything?
That's pretty good. I think there was also, yeah, it's true. We were the Botanical District, but we commented on the whole park.
Yeah.
There was an idea to, I think it was Linda that was speaking. It would be nice if we did have a garden area in the park. It doesn't have to just necessarily be small gardens. They could be bigger. And if there were a market in the park, you could actually sell what's grown in the park in the market. That was one idea. Also wanting to know if there could be some safety things in the park, whether it's lighting or safety pole or emergency call boxes, something like that. And to make nice big dog parks so that the dogs can have their dog space and the gardens can have their garden space. So I am.
And Mary also was interested in, more immersive ADA compliant trails. So for people with wheelchairs and strollers and other, things on wheels like rollerblading, they might be able to actually get into a wooded area as opposed to, just a sidewalk on the side of the road. And then her husband also had the comment about the nature center or museum to commemorate the site, which were both two topics that have come up a lot.
Definitely. Thank you, Andrew. That was a good summary. I just noticed in the chat, there were 2 suggestions for bike rental, perhaps at key entrances to the park. Yeah. Oh, and so Mary got those. So we have like some parallel feedback going on here. That's great. So let's see, who would like to go next? Would you like to talk about would the buildings group like to give a report?
Yeah, so we had a really productive conversation. Sarah from Preservation Long Island talked about the importance of the cemetery and creating some connection between the experience of the people that lived in the hospital in some way through the archives and the records of the hospital, of connecting people with their family members that might have been either patients or staff at the hospital. And she also talked about the importance of the public being very involved in the understanding that there's going to be some number of buildings that are demolished, being very involved in the mitigation of those buildings and how they're represented and presented to the public in physical form. Joanne from the Kings Park Heritage Museum, who's been very helpful with our research, talked about the road markers that were used. There were a number of road markers used along the greenway, these bronze things that had pictures and interpretation of the park, which is some of them have disappeared. And creating a more permanent exhibit to show those buildings that have been lost, and how we might repurpose salvaged materials from buildings that have been demolished. She mentioned specifically bricks that might be used for some kind of memorial for people that lived or worked on the hospital's campus. Robin mentioned recognizing and reconnecting with the experience of the park, also mentioned the informational signs, and how underlining Sarah's point of how to better involve the public in recognizing the mitigation and representation of the history to the community. John, who's, I think it was his aunt that worked in building 93, mentioned the idea of reusing building 5. We talked about creating some space for the Heritage Museum and the idea of stabilizing and repaving the Kings Park Boulevard, or having some connection to it, some interpretation of it. Mike mentioned his desire for retaining the natural setting of the park, less about the buildings and more of its natural setting, which is, as you mentioned, Gail, integral to the site. And a lot of people expressed interest in the importance of York Hall and its connection to the community, which is within living history. I don't know if Michelle or anyone else that was on the SHPO have anything to add, but.
Great recap, Nate.
Yeah, the only thing that I would add is to underscore that, I mean, people said many things, as you mentioned, Nate, but there was kind of an overriding theme of interpreting the sort of emotional connections that people in the community have with the site, and making sure that doesn't get lost.
How do we offset the loss of the built environment in a more meaningful fashion? Sometimes mitigation isn't, some of the solutions are photographs or floor plans, and I think a lot of what was expressed is a lot more meaningful. So I think there were some great ideas put out there.
Right, the term mitigation seems a little bit clinical in this case, not, I mean, no pun intended, a little bit clinical, but I think there's a way of really connecting the history of the community and the feeling of place with the materials that are remaining in a way that doesn't necessarily necessitate the retention of all of the buildings, right? There's a way of doing this in a more meaningful way. And a lot of that has to do with engaging and connecting to the community. So that was really the overriding theme.
Wow, that's really wonderful. Thank you, Nate and Bill. So finally, we have the Southgate Recreation area.
Indeed, we do. So we had a great discussion. We touched on a lot of different points. Initially, we were discussing Tiffany Fields, which was brought up by John, and just that this Tiffany Fields had, a real historic soul. And if we are going to have recreation on the site, we need to sort of think smartly about how we're going to consolidate that recreation. And so we sort of discussed our plans to consolidate recreation and the comfort stations, concessions at the south end of the site, while still allowing Tiffany Field to be the thing that it is. And then we also touched on, in terms of developing active recreation fields and the existing ecology in the area, where the best possible places are to lay out those fields. So there is existing sort of late successional woodlands that should be avoided, which Mike noted. And also Jennifer brought up the fact that there's a lot of infrastructure underlying the site. And so when we are thinking about any sort of groundwork, that we should be careful to overlay all the existing infrastructure with any other topographical analysis that we're doing when we're citing anything. So that was a really helpful point. We also touched on some of the potential sort of conflict between the sewage placement and concerns regarding that, and how best to make those goals of sewering the downtown match with the park's goals. But yeah, it was a great conversation and touched on a lot of different topics.
Wow, thank you, Mary. this has been really great feedback, and I see there's more out. There's a turkey trot on Thanksgiving. There's some community announcements in the chat. So we will capture those as well. But if anyone else has any overall closing remarks, Chip, you want to jump back, or George, you want to come back in and send us home with some good thoughts?
Just thank you for everyone again. I went to a couple of breakout rooms, and discussions were great and great suggestions. Unfortunately, a couple of tough questions for us about certain things, but we appreciate everybody. It's a great momentum we've got going, and as I already said, a few more months. Summertime, this should be wrapped up, and hopefully we'll have something that everybody is happy with, and that we're able to move forward and have a great blueprint for the future for Nissequogue. So thank you, everyone.
Yes, and I'm going to share my screen one more time quickly. So we do have the park has its own email address, which is here, nissequogueriver.plan@parks.ny.gov. So you can email, that email goes to the team and is distributed, and we do take your input through that as well. So this is a touch point, but it's an ongoing process and a dialogue with you all. So that's one way of communicating ideas. If you have an idea in the middle of the night, you email nissequogueriverpark.plan. And then just also a reminder of the website where all of the documents for the master plan are stored. So all of these presentations, as well as the public scoping document that will be released in the next couple of weeks. That's the companion document to the EIS. So we would also like your written feedback. So just a reminder on that. So thank you very much, everyone.